I'm so scared. I'm so scared. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Inspirational Mondays. Mm, As part of Canadian Stage's classroom series that's happening over the next 5 weeks. My name is Tyria McCarthy, and I will be your moderator for this session. Inspirational Mondays is an invitation into the minds of some of Canada's leading artists and thinkers as they share with us artistic provocations, ideas, and inspirations over the course of this lockdown. I am coming to you live from my living room, which is in Toronto, my home. And I would like to acknowledge the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Misagas of the Credit River, the Métis, and all the peoples recognized and unrecognized for their stewardship of this land that I now call home. Our guest for today's session is Jordan Tannahill. Jordan Tannahill is a multi-award winning and internationally renowned artist who works in dance, theater, and film and all the spaces in between. He's going to share with us some ideas that has been hibernating. It's a collection of ideas that has been hibernating for him over this period of isolation. The format for this session will go as follows. Jordan will share with us, and once he's done, we'll open the floor up for questions and comments. Feel free, if you have questions and comments over the course of the sharing, feel free to type them out in the comment section in the YouTube channel from which you're watching this show. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Jordan Tannahill.
Hey, thank you so much, Joey.
Welcome, Jordan.
It's a lovely intro. And thank you everyone who's tuned in. As Teria said, these are just some ideas that I've been sort of reflecting on over the past couple of weeks in lockdown. So they're still unformed, and I'm excited to talk with you about them today, and also to hear back from you any questions or ideas they may spark in you. I've been thinking a lot about intimacy, community, and the body, I guess, in lockdown, and for me, how these ideas kind of link to the idea of the ecstatic. And by that, I mean experiences by which we transcend ourselves, by which we are sort of, there's a kind of rupture from ourself and our body, or in which indeed we become somehow something other than ourselves. And I guess the idea of the ecstatic has lived within me over the past few months and a couple of years, actually, since moving to London, through my exploration of the fetish community here in London and rave culture. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about how, for me, my experience and exploration of fetish and the rave community link to this idea of queer ritual. And I've been thinking quite a bit about how, since time immemorial, humans have used music, repetitive dance, hallucinogenics, masks, and costuming to enter the ecstatic space and rupture from themselves and become something other than themselves, and to transcend their selfhood. And this has been, this is a kind of, these are the sort of the foundational elements of cultic ritual practice around the world, and sort of through many cultures. And it's been interesting to me as an atheist to kind of sort of have realized a few months back that I had sort of found myself in these spaces by way of a kind of queer secular means. But for me, it's also still been a very sort of these have created very profound experiences for me that are linked to my sense of self and spirituality and my sexuality, my politics, and my sense of community. And so, yeah, that's what I'm going to be kind of deconstructing a little bit today, is the relationship between fetish culture, rave culture, and this idea of ritual. So I'm just going to, these are some images here from, so I moved to London about 4 years ago, and began going to a number of queer raves like Inferno, Adonis, Chapter 10, and around the same time, I just began to realize kind of how expansive my sexuality could be. It could be political, it could be performative, it could be quite playful and silly, it could be, there could be elements of role play, and that kind of performativity began to become quite exciting to me. And one thing I really latched onto in rave culture was this element of dress up and costuming and masking. And I associated that, for me, one of a very, very sort of influential figure in my sort of queer coming of age was Leigh Bowery, who's depicted in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. And I watched a few years ago a film by Charles Atlas called Hail the New Puritan, which it's a documentary, kind of mockumentary about Michael Clark, the choreographer and dancer, who has had a major impact on British dance. And he was really bringing a lot of sort of countercultural and queer cultural iconography and imagery to bear on contemporary dance in Britain in the 80s, and really shook things up. And that documentary for me, Hail the New Puritan, was just so kind of alive with the sort of the queer party scene of the 80s. And it was so intoxicating to me as a young queer youth. And so I think when I moved to London, I really, that something kind of that was seeded by that film kind of awakened in me. And I'm just going to see if I can play this. So that video on the left is a shot it is a film that I took, a very, very short video from Inferno, which is a rave that happens in Hackney Wick here in London. The upper right-hand corner is a shot that I took at the Whole Festival, which is essentially a kind of a 3-day rave that takes place in a kind of sort of industrial wasteland outside of Berlin that has been kind of rewilded by nature, and it's this very kind of queer utopic space. And then the lower right-hand corner is from the Berlin Party in London, and so for me, when I talk about dress up and fetish, it's actually kind of really intense for me to be talking about this so kind of publicly for the first time. But I can't see you guys, so it sort of allows me to do this. But thank you for holding this space for me. So I've been really interested specifically in like latex subcultures and bondage and pup play. So this is me in fetish gear. And for me, what fetish gear does, there's a sexual element to it, but it's also a deeply psychological and almost kind of a spiritual kind of relationship that I have, or reconfiguring my relationship with my sense of self and my body, insofar as that it places me in a completely different headspace, where I'm not quite myself, I'm not quite human, and indeed in this case, I'm sort of in a way almost kind of occupying this kind of hybrid animal and human space. I think what's so interesting for me about the dog mask is that humans have turned to animals as metaphors, as kind of metaphors for untrammeled states of being from time immemorial. So, we think of like the faun in Greek mythology as a kind of representation of sort of libidinal desire, or Pan, the god, and the ways in which sort of animal states exist in this kind of as in this kind of libidinal metaphoric space that allows us to set aside some of our kind of human preoccupations with form or decorum or sort of social politeness, or indeed our own sense of shame, perhaps. And so it kind of allows us to kind of unlock this sort of state of pleasure or just a pure experience. And I think there's something for me that's really kind of telling about the just deconstructing for me the definition of fetish. So fetish, of course, can be, as I've described it here, a kind of sexual desire in which gratification is linked to a sort of, to an abnormal degree, to a certain object or piece of clothing or perhaps a part of the body. And it's, of course, politically and culturally informed. So, the fact that I attribute sort of erogenous or, sort of sexual dynamics to latex or the dog mask is a cultural construction. But fetish also, the definition of also, to define fetish as an inanimate object worshipped for its supposed magical powers, perhaps because it's believed to actually be, in fact, imbued with a spirit. And fetishes, these objects, of course, exist in countless cultures and countless mythologies through history and around the world. And this particular carving you see here is the Lion Man of Ulm, which is made from mammoth ivory 40,000 years ago. And it's the earliest known representation of something beyond human experience. So this was, as you can see, it's a human form within a lion's head. This is the first example that we have on Earth of humans conjuring something into form that does not exist in the real world. It was discovered in 1935 in a cave near Ulm in Germany. And here we see nature has been reimagined and the boundary between human and animal has been dissolved. And knowing what we do about the tools that were available to humans 40,000 years ago, we believe that this sculpture would have taken approximately 400 hours to have made, which is an unbelievable amount of time for a very small society to have allowed, an able-bodied person, to take time away from gathering food, tending to the fire, protecting children, and so forth from predators. And so we have to ask ourselves, why would a community make such a large investment to produce an object which could play no sort of part in its physical survival? And of course, it's because it was existed purely for ceremonial and ritual purposes. I'm going to quote Jill Cook, who's an expert from the British Museum in deep history. And she writes, "I think it is probably more about the community's psychological survival, something that strengthens the sense of themselves as a group. We do not know whether the Lion Man was a deity, a spiritual experience, a being from a creation story, or an avatar used to negotiate with the forces of nature. But it is an object that makes sense only if it is part of a story, what we might now call a myth. There must have been a narrative or a ritual to accompany the statue that would explain its appearance and its meaning. What that story was, of course, we can now only guess. It was about humans and animals, obviously, but presumably it was also about something beyond ourselves, beyond nature, which can somehow help to strengthen a community and enable it to overcome dangers and difficulties." So, as I've said, music, masks, exhaustive, repetitive dance, and hallucinogenics have been used to transcend ourselves for eons. And as long as we've had recorded history, we also know that humans around the world have donned animal masks to engage in these cultic rituals. And just because, of course, I showed you myself earlier in a dog mask, I thought it would be interesting to show you on the left-hand side a fetish of the god of Anubis from ancient Egyptian mythology. And in the upper right-hand corner, we have Xolotl, who's an Aztec god. And in the bottom right-hand corner is another Aztec god, actually, Xochipilli, who is the god of dance, music, flowers, and homosexuality. Which I love those things being linked together. And here he's depicted in the throes of ecstatic hallucination on a throne, which you can't see, it's been cut off here, but he's actually sitting on a throne that's decorated with magic mushrooms. And so the idea of like dog-headed gods and demigods and sort of half humans, half animals in states of ecstatic transport exist in mythologies from Mesoamerica to ancient Egypt to ancient Greece, the Indus Valley, Shinto Japan, and so on. And so that for me is kind of in a way sort of yeah, it gave me some sorry, I'll just explain who these creatures are here. The statue depicted here is the statue of Hermanubis. This is from the 1st century CE. It's a Greek statue, and yeah, and so for me, I guess, as I've said earlier, that these I think it speaks to this kind of human desire to transcend our humanhood and our bodies, and to tap into what we believe to be a kind of maybe another plane of consciousness that the animal world or the natural world seems to possess. Just going to play this video here. So that's a video that I took at the Whole Festival outside of Berlin last summer. It makes me quite, it sort of makes me long for human contact and for that sort of that space for the ecstatic, in which sweaty bodies are pressed up against one another, and in these sort of moments of transport. And so these things were kind of have been kind of swirling in my head as I've been going to raves recently, and thinking, I go to raves in my dog mask, often high on mushrooms or other various substances, and thinking that I had sort of found myself quite accidentally pursuing these impulses which humans have had for millennia. And I'm not going to suggest, of course, that raves are an equivalent experience to a sacred or spiritual ceremony of these various cultures through history. But it does point to this very sort of basic human need that we seem to have to harness dance and costuming and music, hallucinogenics, and community to exceed ourselves and to reach the ecstatic. Oh yeah, and this is just a slide of some pottery that depicts a Seder play. So I've been thinking a little bit also about the connection with my work as a performance maker, and thinking about what spaces exist in our in our communities to enable us to reach the ecstatic. I mean, concerts can kind of sometimes reach that place of transcendence, although to some extent, I still feel like I'm a kind of audience member, and there's a kind of event that's happening beyond me. Whereas the rave, I do feel like I'm sort of a conduit for the experience that is occurring, that we're all kind of an active participant in it. Theater feels often much more passive to me. I'm often very much just an audience member sitting, or I might be standing or walking through a kind of environmental piece of theater, but I'm still a spectator more often than not. Whereas the Seder play for me is such an interesting example of another kind of sort of hybrid space, not quite a rave, but a space where abandon or ecstasy could possibly exist. And they were, plays in which the participants often, well, they were men in a large circle who were in states of intoxication, often wearing masks, engaged in kind of a rhythmic chanting and dance that would devolve over the course of over the performance into revelry, or perhaps even sex, or some kind of ribald play. But there's this aspect of ritual and ceremony and play and transgression. We can only kind of piece together what the Seder play was. I mean, we only have a few great written records and some depictions of it, and we have a sense, of course, of the dithyramb and some of its structures. But for me, it kind of exists in this sort of speculative kind of this kind of event horizon of possibility. I mean, I'm sure I'm making it something that perhaps it never was, but for me, it seems to embody the possibility of theater being a kind of intoxicating and ecstatic event in which I am, as a performer, also a witness, and as an audience member, also a participant. And I sort of want to circle back to this idea of play and of theater. And, you know, I think there are so few spaces as adults where we can dress up and play and just play for the sake of it. And I mean, that's sort of weeded out of our lives as we grow up. And for those of us who work in theater or arts or, you know, in performance, we have the great gift, I guess, of being able to play with each other, but it's still our work, and it's still often circumscribed and prescribed into these very specific kind of containers. And so, you know, what are the spaces of pure play, of pure dress up, of pure transformation, of pure abandon? I want to just also end off the talk on pointing towards a few Canadian artists working in performance who I feel, who I do feel that sense of queer ritual alive within their work. And I can name so many people. I just picked three because I had three spaces to show you images from. But But you know, on the left here, Aisha Sasha John. On the upper right-hand corner, the work of Andrew Tay, and in the lower right-hand corner is the work of Public Recordings. In particular, a piece that they did called Dance Songs, which I first saw when I moved to Toronto. I was, I think, like 18 or 19 when I saw that show, and it was just so, for me, it really approximated the feeling of being in a club in that state of kind of abandon or release at the time, better than any show that I had seen, and perhaps still better than any show I've seen. But these are artists who I feel like are really alive to the ability, to the potential of the live moment to contain that limitless energy or possibility that I feel at a rave, in which there's the sense that the audience is a participant in a ritual or in a sacred event, but yet it's not sanctimonious. It's not full of sort of the dogma, perhaps, of religion. It's full of play and improvisation and the things that give us that sense of kind of joyful frisson, like sexuality, for instance, at a rave. I just want to kind of point to those artists, and of course to mention that Andrew Tay will be speaking as part of a masterclass later in the Canadian Stage Classroom series. So definitely check that out. And that's it for now. Thank you so much, and I'm really excited to hear your questions and to talk to you and to Teria about these ideas.
Hello, Jordan. Welcome back. I really enjoy this conversation. Like, I think what I keep thinking about is how the role of play, like actually thinking of play, how that actually is going to shift in the near future as we move out of COVID. Like, how do you actually also, as an artist, envision the role of play in our future society post-COVID? Like, if you were to speak to it a bit.
Yeah, it's and actually, just to ask another question on top of your question is what does that, you know, what does that look like if we're socially distanced, right? I think
exactly.
For me, you know, like so much of what makes that kind of play so invigorating and exciting is that it's intimate, and it challenges our conception of what our body is and what our body can do, and it's very, I guess it's a very embodied kind of play. Which I do fear being compromised or drastically altered in the time of COVID. I can't say what it will look like. But I do think that the next time that we are in a shared space, whether it's a party, whether it's a theater, I think we will be reminded of how sacred that space is. Yes, you know, I think we as you know, as people who work in the live arts, I think it's very natural and inevitable sometimes that we can grow a bit cynical about seeing plays and seeing work. And, you know, even if we love people who are making that work, it becomes part of our job, you know, and we enter with a certain kind of critical lens. But my God, the first time we come back into that theater, that space, or into a party, I feel like that cynicism is I really think it'll be definitely not top of mind. I think what'll be top of mind is how incredible it is to be together.
Yeah, that's true. I have a question from Michael Anthony, and he wants to know, how can a written play be more inclusive of the audience so they can participate in a real sense? Improv doesn't give the participation and popularity it deserves. Improvisation doesn't, and deserves a play. It deserves a play. I don't think I fully understand that.
But yeah, but the question, so how can kind of text, kind of create potential for that kind of liveness and that sort of that interaction with the audience or implicate them in the live experience? It's a really good question. I mean, that is a fundamental tension, I think, between playwriting and the liveness of theater and making work that is really attentive to the live moment.
Yeah.
And I wrestle with that all the time, and I think I really strive as a playwright to create open texts that are not too prescriptive, or that I should say that open texts that give the director and give the performers a lot of space to rediscover each time it's produced. And I do think that hopefully when I write plays, that they are reimagined for the specificity of each locality in which they're presented and the context in which they're presented. And I should say too that I don't think that like audience interaction is I often find that like a lot of shows that have audience interaction, it's a kind of there's a sort of false illusion of agency, or like we actually aren't, our involvement is actually not necessary to this piece in any kind of way. I'm often happy to sort of sit and watch a show as well, but I think there's I do think that what I'm seeking at the moment, at least in new writing for the stage or old reinterpretations of classics, is how attentive is this text to this present live moment that we're in.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And what we're doing in the theater. Sorry.
Yeah. The next question is, can a digital space be imbued with the same charge as the fetish parties, raves, and clubs?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's what we're trying to do. I mean, of course, sexuality has thrived online for decades, and sexuality has, the internet has changed and transformed sexuality in such exciting ways. I would say that during COVID, the experience that I've had with online kind of party culture that I feel has been the most successful and revelatory was Club Quarantine, which is a Toronto creation, and just a big shout out to Club Quarantine. I think what that team is doing is totally extraordinary and inspiring, and it's creating a space of performativity and subversion and perversity and play and community, crucially, at a period of time in which we're so isolated. I had the great pleasure of being a sort of go-go dancer, a puppy go-go dancer. My friend Katie Silmanis, aka Astra, when she was performing at Club Quarantine a couple weeks ago, and it was I had such a blast. It's pretty late here, like Club Quarantine doesn't start till like 2 a.m. in London.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
And my neighbors, and we live in very small flats here in London, so I was like, jamming on one bar of sound in my kitchen, but it was great. I still had a great time.
We're actually throwing a party in Summerworks Canadian Stage, and Club Quarantine have a party coming up this Friday. So you should log on, and
it's gonna be great.
Let's get it going. I have another question from the next question is from says, do you think that there is a capacity for traditional theater where folks are seated and witnessing the work of artists to achieve the same kind of heightened beyond ourselves experience?
For and sure. Sorry.
I was going to say that question is from Rob.
Yay, Rob Kempson. Hey, Rob. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. It's so awesome, and for tuning in. Yes, for sure. I mean, I think theater, of course, is going to activate and deliver, other things. It engages intellectually, and it can engage us spiritually and emotionally. It will. I'm trying to think of plays. There have been plays where I feel kind of shook or feel at a kind of an embodied reaction to it the way that I might maybe from like a rave or a concert, but it's rare at times. Maybe like I've had that experience watching a Romeo Castellucci show once, which I felt really sort of shook by, in a way that felt kind of like spiritual and physical. And and I don't think we need to ask theater necessarily to every show to do that. And I think theater and plays do such incredible things that are disparate and distinct from raves or a fetish sex party.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's like, as a polemic, as an idea, like how can we, I think it's a great question, Rob, and I don't really have an answer to it, but how can we capture those kind of limit experiences, those intensities, and bring them into theater? I'm sort of way. But in a show I did at Canadian Stage a few years ago called Declarations, I was really focused on trying to create a ritual within the space of the theater. In this case, it was a ritual of in relation to my mother and her terminal illness, and and the question being, how can one articulate the sum of a life in dance and in text and in movement? And yeah, it wasn't a rave, but I was hoping to kind of achieve that same sense of or a sense of the sacred ritual within a theater.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a good question, Rob. I'm searching for the answer too.
The next question that I have is from Colleen Murphy. It's from Colleen, and it says, we just lost Jordan. Technical difficulties. We'll just give it a few moments.
Hello.
Hey, and you're back.
UK Wi-Fi is not the best.
The question goes, how do you redefine liveness at distance? That's
how do we redefine liveness at distance? Yeah, at distance. It's a great question, Colleen. Yeah, I mean, it's there's just getting, I guess, maybe back to like Club Quarantine. I did feel like when I was participating in Club Quarantine that I felt like this was a kind of a sort of porous live, like a porous, like the internet felt really porous for me. Like I was almost like the image I have is like, imagining all these windows, all these people dancing in their various rooms. I felt like it was almost like this, like my computer screen was suddenly like this living organism, like a sort of sea sponge, and like I was sort of glimpsing into all these windows of liveness in these private spaces, these domestic spaces that were, of course, secluded from one another, but were still very much live and attentive to this collective moment that we were creating in this virtual space. And that felt very alive to me and very, very exciting. And yeah, and I think back on a very early project I did back in 2013 with Zach Russell and Oais Lightwalla and Naomi Skorna as producer. It was a play that I wrote called Rihanna Boy 95, and it was a live streamed play that we performed each night. Well, Oais performed each night as a monologue from a bedroom using just a computer. And at the time, it was, we hadn't encountered other live plays being done over YouTube Live. So it was sort of this novel thing that we were trying to experiment with, was that very question, colleague, is how do you define or redefine liveness at a distance? How can you, what is it to hold someone's face talking to you live in your laptop, on your lap, in your bed, as they have this kind of confessional YouTube monologue. And it's so interesting now, like, a few years later, to see so many different people exploring, in such, immensely more creative ways than we did, this idea of liveness online. So yeah, I think the answer also is we're seeing, the lockdown is producing ever new conditions of liveness online, which is exciting.
Yeah, that's true. That is very true. Next question is from David C. Jones, and he goes, how do you invite audiences to play? He's saying that he's created an and improv. He's created scripted improv hybrids of shows, and
Mm-hmm.
the block has always been people being afraid of getting pulled onto the stage. So how do you invite audiences to play?
You know, in a lot of work I do, I invite them to play in their minds and in their hearts and in their souls as they watch. And I think that's a good question, David. Like, how do we implicate an audience in ways that are embodied? You know, I mean, there are many theater companies that do work that, you know, is environmental and is, you know, promontory. And I've worked with the incredible creators of Blue Mouth Inc. and Jennifer Tarver to stage a show that involved, you know, audience members canoeing to the Toronto Islands and then walking over several hours through forest groves and into, you know, along the beach and stuff. So I've done that work, and also I've done work for me that I mean, I think for me at the moment, I think my strength as an artist, as a maker of performance, is in theater and gallery settings where the audience is a witness or is a spectator, and that's fine, that's great. But I think the question again, I would say, is kind of almost exists in the world of the polemic. You know, how can we implicate an audience in ways that feel ecstatic and embodied within the theater? You know, that is, I think, something that I would try to ask myself every time I stage work. And I see artists and directors who are able to punch me in the gut from a distance as I sit in my seat in a way that, like, feels like a bass drop at a rave, you know, or feels like as incredible as, you know, having someone touch your skin when you're wearing full body latex.
Yeah. I'm gonna go back to some of the conversation, the ideas that you were presenting earlier on about the fetish practice. When I moved to Canada, I used to kind of talk about the idea of Ghana in a traditional practice. We have fetish priest. A fetish priest, a spiritual guide, like that's what they do. They communicate with with the ancestors, but also like the fetish, like the idea of having a fetish, like having an idol, for lack of a better term to describe it. So when you were talking about the idea of fetish and going back to back in history, kind of bringing some of these images up, I keep thinking about the role of the priest in this play. Like, what is that? And trying to kind of find ways in it. And I keep thinking about that because also in the Ashanti the Akans, they have this fetish priest called the Konkwanachi, who apparently, in the belief system, chanted a golden stool from the sky. And the golden stool still exists, and it's to their kingdom. As long as they hold on to the golden stool, they don't lose their power. So it's one of those things where you said it, and that was where my mind went. Like I went right there, and I was able to kind of hold on to something that I was like, oh, I know what that is. But the interesting part about it is Akonfuanochi danced for hours nonstop. So he somehow in the process kind of elevated himself somewhere else for this idol to come down, which speaks to a bit of what you're saying. I was get into my question is in your experiences during these raves, how has the POC representations been in these encounters that you've been in?
Well, it's a great question, and I think that I would say in London it's been quite strong in London. I mean, something I guess akin to some of the better spaces I would have seen in Toronto, but I would say that, like, I would say in Berlin and in continental Europe, I would say much less so. You know, I think that probably as the result of so many different things, and I would say that I think like the fetish community I sort of think is quite sort of I couldn't maybe speak to that as much, but I would say the rave community, I would think, is feels quite diverse, and I would say also like gender and body inclusive in all kinds of other, like it's sort of broadly inclusive in London, at least the ones I'm gravitating towards. I'm sure there are others that are probably less so, or definitely sort of more white male, perhaps, like white gay male. But yeah, I think I've sort of noticed sort of less diversity within some spaces on the continent. That being said, I would say the whole festival, again, I mentioned in Berlin, is like, I still hold that as like such a high bar of inclusivity and of of really creating a kind of a space and a safe and kind of sacred space for revelry, for pleasure, and for countercultural politics. I think it's a really cool space.
Yeah, nice. As you move on, as you like covered like all these ideas that you're accumulating, hibernating with, like mixing up, what are you intending of like? Is this a process that you go through as a creator of kind of investigating, thinking about these ideas and moving it into a process of creation, or is it just things that kind of sits with you as a person?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I do want to see, I guess, more of these sort of lived experiences filtered into my work, and I definitely I think they live in places and in some new projects I've been developing and some new writing that I've been doing over the past couple of years. But I think, you know, in one of our chats, you said something really beautifully, Teria, which was, you know, culture is also just what you live day to day, and it's how you live and how you move through the world, and who your friends are, and you know, like the things you, the ways in which you relate to the world with your body. And I think for me, that's that. You know, the cultural space that I occupy here in London, of which those are a part, will kind of inevitably inform everything that I do. And I think that's yeah, that's what I think. And I should say too that there's like just a sort of shout out that I feel like there's been some really cool, like there's always been amazing parties in Toronto as well. Hot Nuts was such a huge, you know, a major influence on me when I was, you know, coming of age. And there's also some cool, like I was back this time last year actually, went to a rave called Poor Detroit in Toronto, which was pretty great too. So yeah, there's so many, you know, the scene in Toronto is super rich as well. And but it did kind of open up for me in a big way when I came to Berlin and London. And yeah, so I do hope to kind of filter more of that experience into my work going forward.
Yeah. It's so interesting because I keep thinking back to Rob's question, right, about how does traditional theater have the capacity like for people to actually have experiences. And I keep thinking, because I've always thought of theater as a spiritual experience, whether it's actually like it's one Mel said something in a conversation that we were having during this period. It talked about the energy that exists between the artist on stage and the audience that are watching, which is live, and it changes every time you have a performance. And for me, I can only describe that experience as being spiritual, right? Because it's you have someone on stage embodying something else that includes a part of themselves, and you witnessing. It's so present, right? So like I keep thinking about how important conversations like this or experiences like this are to us as artists, and how that kind of helps us move our understanding of others in the world a bit further, right? Like even with your
And as you said, I think that like the ecstatic does exist. I've definitely had moments where I was just, you know, incredibly punctured by something that I've seen on stage, that, you know, I was just sitting there in silence, you know, not moving, and like was transformed in some way by something I saw on stage, you know. So those, as you said, those moments of spiritual encounter or of ecstasy or of puncture do that's I think what we all seek in some way as audiences when we go to the theater, is to be transformed in that way.
So you've been in London for 4 years now.
Yes.
Can you share with us some of the cultural aspects of Toronto that you miss, using culture as a broad subject? Can you tell? I love London, but what is it that you're missing from home at the moment?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing, which will always be the case, is my community. I mean, I still, like, as an artist, have been so shaped and so formed by the Toronto, you know, performance community and art community and music community. But like I realized the extent to which I will always be making work for my peers, and in some way I'll be always making work for those peers. You know, you know, those like foundational artists and friends who I made throughout my 20s. You know, I'm always going to be a Canadian artist, and I'm always going to have that vantage point. And you know, I think I'm, you know, hyper aware of class and colonization in Britain. I mean, it's so I mean, you can't not be. It's pretty pervasive, and I do think that for me, I think what I'm what for me feels so special about Toronto and about Canada as a whole is, you know, this ability to really grow up with a group of peers and to push each other and to inspire each other. And I think, I really miss that.
And in talking about like your practice as an artist in London, what are the differences? This is me kind of going. What are the differences artistically in the art that you experience in there and the art that you experience here in Canada? Would you be able to speak to that?
I think there, like, I would say that the commercial engine in London of theater exerts a greater, like, it drives creation here in a way that it doesn't in Canada. I mean, I think, and you know, some ways for better and definitely for worse. Like, I think there's a kind of dramaturgy or a kind of vision of a successful play or a programmable play here that is sort of big and flashy in a way that is just sort of like we don't really care about in Toronto, or there's other concerns. You know, there's other concerns in Canada that we're you know, preoccupied with and trying to fill out an 800-seat theater on the West End every night. You know, and there's things to be learned from that as well. I'm definitely excited by what, you know, I tried to get to Berlin and to Europe, you know, a lot to see work there as well. And of course, there's all kinds of work in London as well. It's, you know, there's experimental stuff as well. But I think there's just, I would say that the impact of the commercial sector is definitely something that I notice is very different here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just I'll read the questions as they come in, but I'm just going to be selfish right now and take this opportunity to keep chatting with you.
Yeah, it's great. I love it.
What is one of the things that you're most excited for post-COVID? And like I say post-COVID, thinking like it might be next week, but we all know it's not next week. But so what are some of the things that you're excited for? And how is that? And also, double combo question. How is this period shifting your thinking? And you shifting your thinking and your idea, your thinking as an artist, and what are some of the things that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely looking forward to some sex, but yeah, I mean, but more like, you know, kind of broadly about the you know, re-engaging my body in all kinds of different ways. I mean, I think like one thing that, as we were saying, that, you know, the rave is an kind of an embodied experience, and so can going to the gallery or going to the theater. Those can all be embodied experiences. But I'm just looking forward to kind of reawakening my body and sort of learning and experiencing and kind of seeing through my body as much as just being a kind of floating head. So I'm looking really forward to that. And in terms of how it's shaped me, I guess I think it's well, it's certainly made me really really value as I said earlier, the you know, my community and and like just that sacred space of live performance. I think for me it's really clarified for me why I make performance, because of course I've been just seeing a lot of, well, I've seen some performance on tape. I've been watching a few, you know, sort of archival recordings of theater, but I'm watching a lot of film, and film is amazing. Film is an extraordinary medium, and it does something different than theater. It's something completely different, and I'm just, you know, I think about that every day. So I think it's really kind of reinvigorated my desire to do things in front of people and have things done in front of me.
Which is like, I find that interesting to hear, knowing very well that you've worked in multiple mediums, right? Like you've done the film, you've done dance, you've done theater, like, so it's so interesting to hear you say that one of the things that you're looking forward to is like doing things in front of people. Are you thinking the next project you're going to be working on is a play?
Definitely. I mean, I'm trying, definitely writing something at the moment, but thinking, like, and definitely in some way, hopefully, you know, incorporating some of these things that we talked about today. About the aesthetic and the embodied experience.
Yeah. I also know that you just celebrated your birthday not too long ago.
Thanks.
Happy belated.
Thank you. I know,
um,
it's very, very quiet, but very lovely, lovely birthday with
birthday.
my
Yeah.
partner James. It was really nice.
Nice.
It's very
Nice.
sweet.
Nice. What was the day like? How was it? What did you
Um,
get up to? If
we
you don't
went
mind sharing.
Yeah, no, fine. We went to Richmond Park and we just read our books and drank some wine. And I had some really lovely messages from very dear friends. I actually spent most of the time talking to friends back in Toronto, and yeah, making me feel really homesick.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's
Yeah. I know during this period, a lot of people are going through like grief and loss, like loss of work, loss of jobs, like
mm,
all forms. Um, and it can be quite difficult during this time, right? Like we
mhm,
don't know what anyone else is going through. If you were to share some words of encouragement,
mhm.
what would you share? Like, what would be your words of encouragement to especially young artists who might be going through like difficult times,
Yeah,
not knowing what the future holds for the community as a whole? What would
yeah.
be, yeah.
Well, I would say that I definitely you know have immense empathy for people who were struggling with isolation or feelings of like dealing with mental health issues at the moment. I really get that. I really feel that. I have struggled similarly during this time of isolation. I struggle in periods of not isolation as well with those things. So I really feel that, and you know I just send a lot of love, and there are people who are really struggling as well, and who are there for you to be reached out to, even when you really feel like there aren't people. Even near strangers are really open to being reached out to more than one might imagine.
Mhm.
And I think we can kind of forget that. We can kind of forget who might be there for us in times like these. And so yeah, and I really don't envy. I was thinking this, a few days ago, just like imagining a lot of young artists who are graduating, or who are who might have graduated just last year, and who are finding themselves suddenly in a situation where there's basically no community of peers to kind of meet up with in person to see their work or to share their work with. And my heart goes out to you guys, and I'm sure you're finding ways to connect online. And if you ever want to reach out to me, I'm always super up for it, and we'll always be here to chat. So just, yeah, hang in there, stay strong, and hopefully we'll be back in person together soon.
Yay, yay, I echo all that.
Yeah.
Before we go, as our time is coming to an end, would you mind sharing with us maybe, so I know you're a reader, an avid
Mm,
reader, some of the books
yeah.
that you're reading at the moment, some of the
Yeah.
shows you're watching, some films, or can you share with us some things that you're enjoying during this moment
Yeah.
that we can carry with us?
For sure. Well, just before lockdown, actually, it kind of relates to this talk a little bit, in terms of kind of queer transformation, and sort of uh, maybe like bodily transcendence. I was reading a book that I love so much. It's called Paul Takes Paul takes the shape of a mortal girl, or shape or form. Paul takes the shape. Paul takes the form of mortal girl. Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl by Andrea Lawler, and
Nice.
it's about this sort of this young young punk in the sort of 80s in America. It takes place in several parts of America, in Michigan, and in Provincetown, and in San Francisco. But basically, Paul is this shapeshifter who can
Mm,
change his gender. He's identified with by the male pronoun. His gender at will, and his body at will, and it's very sexy, and he engages in all kinds of misadventures, and
nice.
but becomes this kind of extraordinary, um, yeah, almost kind of in a way that, like, what we're talking about, how fetish kind of allows you to kind of become not quite human. I mean, he becomes kind of something other than, or just slightly more than human, kind of this
Mm,
almost sort of um, this sexual spirit that kind of animates America in the 80s, just before and just kind of at the cusp of AIDS. So yeah, that was really a revelation of a book. And I just saw, I think the film that I've seen that I think I was most kind of struck by was a film called Monos. Monos was from it's just last year. I'm just going to look up the director right here. It's from 2019. It's a Colombian film by Alejandro Landes, and yeah, it was extraordinary, and also some really great sequences of altered states and ritual as well.
Just 1 second. I'm trying to I'm trying to read a question
Okay.
that just came in.
Sure.
First day living together, 1 week. As we wait on that, and as I figure it out, technological stuff. The last time I spoke to you, I know you're writing at the moment. Yeah. How was your process of writing? Like when you're writing a novel, different from your process of writing a play? Like,
sure,
do you know? Like, do you go through a different process with that?
Yeah, for sure. So I did just complete my second novel, and actually I would say that it kind of contains some of these themes, or things we've been talking about a little bit today, and I would say that, I mean, writing a novel, I guess, is like a little bit like sort of climbing a mountain alone. It's sort of like every morning you wake up and you just got to sort of like just inch up a little bit closer and a little bit closer, and it's sort of this extraordinary. It feels like a physical feat sometimes, as much as a mental feat of endurance. And whereas a play, I often write very quickly, initially by myself, but then it becomes ultimately a text that lives and breathes with other people in the room. And I think that's what's so joyous about writing a play and working on a play and developing a play, is that it ultimately is a collaborative. It's a product of a community. Even if you write it, even if the actual words are written by yourself alone, you have the voices of others in your head. You have the input of others. You have then everything coming to life by design and by performance, and that sacred space of the rehearsal hall is something that I really miss when I'm going through long periods of isolated writing. And I crave, and I will always say, I think, seek out, as long as I'm an artist. And there's nothing for me that kind of replaces that space of the rehearsal hall, where we're kind of wrestling with ideas and the questions of the day.
Yeah. I am the worst when it comes to technology. I admit that all the time, but I figured out what the question was. It was coming. So the question is, we know that many fetish spaces are like rife with like racism, which acts as a barrier for Black bodies engaging in play in that way. How do you create a more inclusive fetish play space so that all can access it?
It's such a great question. I mean, I would say, I'm sure you would agree that this is a question that extends to so many other aspects of the queer community, whether that's the party scene or rave scene or online hookup culture. I mean, it is rife with racism and with body shaming, with all kinds of body fascism, with ableism. I think it's about, it's about, sort of living by example, choosing the parties and choosing the spaces you kind of want to be part of. And I mean, for me, I guess I have the luxury of that choice. I'm sure many people don't, but be able to say, like, I'm not going to participate in sort of exclusive spaces or kind of body fascist spaces, or, spaces that if I look around and I just see a room of white men, I'm not interested in that. It's not representative of who my friends are and what my vision of queerness is. And I think that, so it's about kind of sort of seeking out those events that, for me, that I can kind of celebrate and find that sort of sense of inclusivity, places where I can bring my own friends to, and the kind of people, who I play with. I think I try to make that representative of my group of friends. But yeah, I really hear that question, Mark J, and I really I think it remains a big issue. And if anyone has any other thoughts about that or things to contribute, I'm would love to hear about that or talk about that elsewhere, after the talk.
Yeah, we were like, Maxwell and I had a brief conversation about that, and I think you cannot even talk about that without talking about the cultural aspect of it. And this time, I'm talking about culture as in like, because my hesitation in going to a space like that will be because I come from a place where we have historic characters such as a Confornoche, who's a fetish priest who dance and call an idol out. So the very idea of doing something like that, for me, is encompassed with a certain level of fear of like, what is it that I'm calling on?
Yeah, I mean,
when you have a spiritual, what is it that you're calling on?
Yeah, even growing up. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. But
no, go on.
Yeah, but I totally hear what you're saying. I mean, even growing up, like, being raised in a a very Christian household. I mean, this idea of ritual or of a fetish or of bodily transformation, all these things were very very taboo, very for me, it's been a real process of breaking through a lot of these complexes around shame and around and fear and that I haven't even had to have the racialized aspect of that to contend with on top of that. But for sure, I think there's lots of unlearning to do. For a lot of people, especially those of us who've been born in and raised in very kind of religious contexts.
And also it's the responsibility of the person going to the party as much as it's the responsibility of the person hosting the party to make sure that the space that is being provided, obviously you never know how safe it might be. Safe for one person but not for the other, but safer so that people can actually have Anyway,
I hear that.
And
sure.
I think that was the last question for today. Thank you so much, Jordan. This is such a privilege. It's been a while. I'm loving all the FaceTime we've had in the last little while.
Me too.
It's been great. Miss you a lot, and thank you for your time. We also want to thank all the people who asked questions and all the people who showed up to listen to this conversation. And thank you for making the time.
I also want to say too that
no, go.
I cut it. Sorry, my internet's so shit. I'm sorry. I just want to say thank you so much to Tewia. First of all, love forever, and as you know, and Canadian Stage. Thank you so much for having me, and for everyone who's facilitated. Kathy, Aiden, everyone backstage, back screen, who's facilitated tonight. I really appreciate it. The Canadian Stage Classroom is such a cool series, and I'm very honored to be kicking things off tonight. And I definitely encourage everyone to check back in on Mondays. Luke Bathory Williamson is such an extraordinary artist. Next week, definitely be here for that. She's gonna blow us all away. And then the master classes coming up over the next little while they're all interesting to me, and I'm sure to you as well. So hope you can tune in.
Yay. Thank you so much, Jordan. Just a quick, so on Wednesday, we have Writing for Screens, which is happening at this from 4 to 6. So if you're available, join us. And on Thursday, we're going to have our study groups where we get to talk about some of the things that we talked about. So if you didn't get a chance to ask your questions, you might get the chance to ask it on Thursday. Thank you so much for joining us.
If anyone had any questions that they didn't get answered tonight, or wanted to talk to me afterwards, totally feel free to reach me on Twitter or also on Instagram. I'm quite on Instagram at the moment, so I'm cruising.utopia on Instagram, and I'm always up for chatting with anyone, strangers or otherwise. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Inspirational
guys.
Mondays.
Yeah.
Till next time. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.